Howdy, my name is Henry Anderson, and today I will be talking about Transcendentalism. Though very much an important religious movement, Transcendentalism was very philosophical, and it extended into the political realm and was heavily accentuated by a strong literary tradition. Of course, I will be focusing mostly on the religious aspect, though I'm going to touch on the others as well. So Transcendentalism is this idea that people should have an original, individual connection to God and nature. It fused together ideas of rationalism and romanticism and formed them into a philosophy of life. It was a movement among literary-minded individuals in the 1830s to 1860s in New England, and it was headed by Ralph Waldo Emerson. So let's talk about Emerson, or Waldo as he liked to be called. He was born in Boston in 1803 to a Unitarian preacher father. Now, the Unitarians are themselves very interesting. They emerged out of a sort of anti-dogmatic movement in the newly established United States. Unitarianism was influenced by Protestant liberalism in Europe and rationalism and stressed individuality and human intellect. So Emerson grew up in the Unitarian tradition, and he was following in his father's footsteps as a preacher of the faith. However, he became familiar and sympathetic to the Romantic movement coming out of Europe. Central to his religious doubts was the doubting of the truth and accuracy of miracles. Now, this is something that we've talked about in class recently. Yes, Transcendentalism is directly influenced by the work of German biblical critics and romantics such as Schleiermacher, who notably doubted the truth of miracles and believed that religion is meant to be an unmediated depth of feeling. Emerson agreed with Schleiermacher in this respect, and he left his job as a Unitarian preacher in 1832. While he was preacher, his sermons were notably minimalist, emphasizing spirituality over doctrine, which reminds me of the gatherings held by a certain group called the Quakers, led by George Fox in Britain. Another interesting parallel between the Quakers and Transcendentalists is this idea of the oversoul. It's this Transcendentalist idea that there's a sort of soul or spirit or mind that encompasses all of nature and can be found within everyone individually. This reminds me strongly of the Quakers' idea of the inner light. Indeed, Transcendentalism held that everyone had the innate ability to connect directly to God and nature and learn more about nature themselves. The oversoul idea is also very similar to Hegel's idea of the Geist, through which things play out in the world. You can see how Emerson was influenced by those who came before him in religious thought, and Transcendentalism does come out of these romantic and rationalist ideas that we've been talking about. The word Transcendentalism comes from the ideas of a man named Immanuel Kant. Kant, who lived 1724 to 1802, was a German philosopher who addressed the epistemological question of, what can we know? He answered it by pushing back against rationalists like Descartes and empiricists like John Locke. He said that rationalism can teach us the empirical limits of the world, but aren't of value beyond that. His idea was that our minds would have to somehow transcend empirical knowledge to learn more about God and the world. Emerson and the Transcendentalists agreed with Kant on the limitations of rationalism and empiricism, and they responded by attempting to transcend beyond the empirical limitations of their minds. The image of the circle was used a lot in Transcendentalism. The outline of the circle is the empirical confines of the world, as described by Kant. But by connecting directly to nature through free will, a person can transcend these confines and begin to fill in the space in the middle. They can fill it in with knowledge and understanding of nature, God, the universe, and themselves. Now, this was a key idea of Transcendentalism driven by Ralph Waldo Emerson. The quote inside is from Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay, Nature. In this quote, you can see how Emerson was stressing spirituality and feeling, showing how Transcendentalism echoes the spiritualistic and romantic movements which influenced it. So, jumping back now to Emerson. We've just gone over many of his influences, and he published his thoughts in his essay Nature in 1836. It laid out his philosophy of Transcendentalism and ushered in the literary movement that came along with it. Emerson was a phenomenal writer. He was an essayist and a poet and is one of the most influential in American history. He wrote a phenomenal essay called Self-Reliance, which was published in 1841. We don't have much time to get into it, but it's great and it emphasizes free will and introspection, and both are key concepts of the Transcendentalist movement. Emerson ran a publication called The Dial, in which he would publish the writings that would come to influence many other Transcendentalists. Among those other Transcendentalists were Henry David Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, Lydia Maria Child, William Henry Hedge, and Theodore Parker. This quote is a foundational principle of Transcendentalism. It's also from nature, and it shows the desire for an intimate connection with God. It expresses Emerson's dissatisfaction with pure rationalism, as he contests that his generation's understanding of God has become passed down, disconnected, and based on the thoughts of those rationalists who came before them. In this quote, you can see that same pushback against rationalism and towards romanticism that we talked about with people such as Schleiermacher. Another notable Transcendentalist is Henry David Thoreau. He grew up in Massachusetts as well. Him and Emerson became friends, and Emerson sort of took on the role of mentor, as he noted Thoreau's literary abilities. Thoreau was a teacher but found it dissatisfying, and he became a poet. In 1845, he moved to Walden Pond, where he lived in direct harmony with nature until 1847. He would spend hours observing nature himself and writing down what he observed. This is how he wrote the essays which would comprise his work called Walden. Walden focused on a direct relationship with nature. It was this idea of the simplicity of life being key, that we are at our best when in natural harmony, that is found throughout Walden and is another key idea of transcendentalism. Walden largely expresses the idea of transcendentalism as a living philosophy that allows people to live a life of joy in direct connection to God and nature rather than being distracted by the hustle and bustle of life. Thoreau wrote his most famous work, Civil Disobedience, and it revealed how transcendentalism extended into the political sphere. Civil disobedience took root among the civil rights movement of the 20th century. Among other transcendentalists, there were abolitionists, feminists, and advocates of progressive change. So Thoreau died in 1862, and his death marked the end of the Transcendentalist movement. It was led by the prolific and genius writing of Emerson and then Thoreau, among others. It was a movement inspired by romanticism and rationalism, and it is centered around the idea that by having a direct connection to nature, we can learn more about nature, God, and ourselves.